Tonight, we turn our attention to a story of once bright promise and deep, lingering pain. I invite you to settle into a quiet space as we unfold the tale of Venezuela under the long and tumultuous leadership of Nicolas Maduro. This is a story of power and poverty, of political erosion and the toll it took on everyday lives, and of a nation transformed in ways few could have imagined when its oil-rich future once seemed assured. In the hush of the evening, imagine the vibrant streets of Caracas, alive with rhythm and life, now marked by the shadows of a different era. Imagine once bustling markets where food and medicine were plentiful, now marked by scarcity. This was Venezuela before Maduro stepped into the highest office, a nation with possibilities lived daily. Yet the path from those hopes to the struggles that followed was marked by economic collapse and political unraveling. As we move a little further into this story, know that it is not just a chronicle of one man, but a portrait of a people caught between enduring hardship and seeking light in long nights. Maduro rose to power as the hand-picked successor to his predecessor, Hugo Chavez, inheriting the mantle of the Bolivarian Revolution. Over the years, Venezuela's democracy weakened. Institutions once meant to hold power in check gradually fell under tighter control, and elections were increasingly questioned by both Venezuelans and international observers. In the stillness that follows, we hear echoes of the protests that erupted when people took to the streets to demand fairness in governance. These demonstrations were met with force. Security operations gave rise to thousands of arrests and reports of violence that drew condemnation from human rights groups around the world. Yet the story of Maduro's reign is also a story of economic decline that reshaped the daily lives of Venezuelans. Once among the wealthiest nations in Latin America thanks to its oil reserves, Venezuela faced hyperinflation, shrinking oil production, and shortages of basic necessities. Millions of Venezuelans chose to leave their homes in search of stability and sustenance elsewhere. As we drift softly onward, we will explore the political machinery that tightened around civic life, the human cost of state repression, and the broader international reverberations of Maduro's rule, culminating in dramatic events that have reshaped Venezuela's contemporary history. Tonight, let us listen closely to this chapter in Venezuela's story. Let us hear it in a voice that honors the experiences of the people, measured and calm, so that the full weight of these years can be understood not just as headlines, but as part of the lived world of countless individuals. We begin not with judgment, but with reflection and a gentle invitation into the depths of a complex and pivotal historical moment. Part 1: An Inherited Throne. I begin tonight not with Nicolas Maduro himself, but with the quiet weight of inheritance. In history, there are rulers who seize power by force, and others who arrive almost gently, carried forward by circumstance, expectation, and the absence of alternatives. Nicolas Maduro belongs firmly to the second kind. His rise was not marked by a dramatic coup or a revolutionary march through palace gates, but by a long shadow cast by another man whose presence lingered long after his voice fell silent. To understand Maduro, we must first rest in the final years of Hugo Chavez, the charismatic architect of Venezuela's Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez was not simply a president. He was a political gravity well. His speeches stretched for hours. His image filled television screens. His language reshaped how Venezuelans spoke about power, class, and destiny. When he fell ill, the country held its breath. In the dim glow of hospital rooms and late-night broadcasts, Chavez prepared the nation for his absence. He named a successor, not from the military elite or the traditional political class, but a former bus driver turned union organizer. A man whose greatest political skill was loyalty. That man was Nicolas Maduro. Maduro's early life was not extraordinary. Born in 1962, he grew up in a working-class household, navigating a city shaped by inequality and political unrest. He found his identity not in universities or elite institutions, but in labor movements. He drove a bus through the dense streets of Caracas, listening to ordinary frustrations, absorbing the language of grievance and solidarity. Politics came to him not as ideology first, but as belonging. When Chávez rose to power in 1999, Maduro followed closely. He became a union leader, then a legislator, then foreign minister. In these roles, he was rarely the star. He spoke less boldly. He deferred more often. He stood beside Chávez, not ahead of him. This positioning mattered. When Chávez's health failed, Maduro was already woven into the machinery of the state, trusted by the inner circle, familiar to the public, and unthreatening to powerful factions. In March of 2013, Chávez died. The country entered a period of public mourning that blurred into political transition. Streets filled with grief. Red shirts and tearful speeches dominated the airwaves. Chávez had been many things, but he had been singular. His absence left a vacuum that could not be filled by personality alone. Maduro stepped forward into that silence. He did not claim to replace Chávez. Instead, he presented himself as a vessel. Chávez, he said, still guided the nation. Chávez spoke through him. Chávez's vision would continue unchanged. It was a powerful message in a society conditioned to emotional politics. In tightly contested elections later that year, Maduro won the presidency by a narrow margin, immediately facing accusations of fraud and illegitimacy. From the very beginning, his rule rested on unstable ground. As I drift a little further into these early months, the atmosphere becomes tense rather than triumphant. Oil prices, long the backbone of Venezuela's economy, were beginning to soften. Years of state control, corruption, and mismanagement had hollowed out production. Inflation crept upward. Shelves grew thinner. What had once been masked by oil wealth now stood exposed. Maduro inherited not only Chávez's ideology, but also his unresolved contradictions. The state had promised abundance while undermining the systems that produced it. The government spoke of sovereignty while relying almost entirely on a single commodity. And now, without Chávez's commanding presence, these tensions began to surface. Protests emerged early. Students marched. Workers complained. Opposition voices, long marginalized, grew louder. Maduro responded not with reform, but with consolidation. Power tightened inward. Courts, electoral bodies, and security forces increasingly aligned with the executive branch. Critics were labeled traitors. Media outlets faced pressure or closure. Each step was justified as defense of the revolution. In the stillness between these moments, something subtle changed. Chávez had ruled through charisma. Maduro ruled through structure. Where Chávez improvised, Maduro enforced. Where Chávez negotiated loyalty through spectacle, Maduro relied on institutions bent to his will. It was less dramatic, more bureaucratic, and ultimately more suffocating. By 2014, Venezuela entered a cycle that would define the coming decade. Economic crisis fed protest. Protest fed repression. Repression fueled international condemnation. Sanctions followed. Maduro framed each external pressure as proof of foreign conspiracy. The narrative hardened. Venezuela, he said, was under attack. Survival required unity. dissent became betrayal. From this point forward, power no longer felt borrowed. It became defended. I pause here, at the edge of transformation. The hesitant successor was becoming something else. Not yet the entrenched ruler he would become, but no longer merely Chávez's shadow. The systems he controlled began to outlast the man who inspired them. Fear replaced charisma. Endurance replaced persuasion. As the night deepens, we leave Maduro at this threshold. Ahead lies the full unraveling of Venezuela's economy, the rise of mass migration, the tightening grip of state violence, and a population caught between exhaustion and resilience. In the quiet that follows, we prepare to move onward. In Part 2, I will guide you through the economic collapse itself. How inflation erased savings. How scarcity became routine. How an oil-rich nation descended into survival mode, one empty shelf at a time. For now, let the story rest here. Let the inherited throne settle under its new weight. Part 2, When Money Lost Its Meaning. As we move gently onward, I invite you to picture a small shop at dawn in Caracas. The metal shutters rise slowly. Inside, the shelves are neat, almost careful in their emptiness. A few bags of rice. Cooking oil locked behind glass. Prices written not in ink, but in pencil, because they will not last the day. This is where the story of Venezuela's collapse becomes intimate. Not in speeches or sanctions, but in quiet transactions where money slowly stopped behaving like money. When Nicolas Maduro took office, the economy was already fragile, stretched thin by years of controls and dependence on oil. For more than a decade, Venezuela had lived off a single pulse. When oil flowed freely and prices were high, the state expanded, subsidized, promised. When oil slowed, everything else faltered. It was a system that required constant motion, constant revenue, and constant belief. The belief did not survive the numbers. Oil production declined steadily, not because the ground had emptied, but because the institutions managing it had eroded. The National Oil Company, PDVSA, once a symbol of national pride, became a political instrument. Experienced engineers left. Maintenance slipped. Revenues were redirected toward short-term political needs rather than reinvestment. When global oil prices fell sharply in the mid-2010s, Venezuela had no buffer left. What followed was not a single crash, but a long descent. Inflation rose first, quietly at the edges. Wages lagged behind prices. People noticed their paychecks felt lighter, though the numbers looked the same. Then inflation accelerated. Prices doubled, then tripled, then changed so fast that shopkeepers stopped labeling goods altogether. By the time hyperinflation took hold, money itself became unreliable. A salary earned in the morning might be worth less by nightfall. I imagine families sitting at kitchen tables, calculators open, trying to decide whether to buy bread now or wait until tomorrow. Waiting was usually a mistake. The government responded not by loosening controls, but by tightening them. Price caps were enforced by decree. If goods disappeared, officials blamed hoarders and smugglers. Soldiers were sent to inspect warehouses. Shop owners were arrested. Entire inventories were seized and sold at state-mandated prices that guaranteed losses. Predictably, fewer people were willing to sell anything at all. Scarcity followed enforcement like a shadow. By 2016, shortages were no longer occasional. They were structural. Medicine vanished first. Antibiotics, insulin, chemotherapy drugs. Hospitals rationed supplies, improvising treatments that belonged to another century. Food followed. Protein became rare. Parents learned which days shipments might arrive and queued for hours in heat and rain, hoping the doors would open before supplies ran out. The queues became part of daily life. Long lines outside supermarkets before sunrise. People holding numbers written on scraps of paper. Children waiting with grandparents. Conversations were soft but tense. Everyone understood that the line itself was labor, unpaid and uncertain. Maduro spoke often during these years. He blamed economic war. He blamed foreign powers. He blamed the opposition. He blamed internal enemies whose names changed with the political moment. And in a way, these speeches mattered less than the policies that continued beneath them. Currency controls remained. Private production was discouraged. Imports slowed. The bolivar, once a stable currency, fragmented into denominations so large they lost all practical meaning. At one point, banknotes were worth less than the paper they were printed on. I pause here to reflect on what hyperinflation does beyond economics. It erodes trust. Contracts lose relevance. Savings evaporate. Planning becomes impossible. When tomorrow is unpredictable, the future shrinks to the present moment. People stop thinking in months or years. They think in meals. In doses of medicine. In bus fares that might change before the ride ends. This psychological narrowing is one of the quiet violences of economic collapse. The government attempted symbolic fixes. Zeros were removed from the currency. New bills were introduced. Wages were raised repeatedly, though always after prices had already surged past them. Each adjustment was framed as relief, yet each arrived too late. Employers could not keep up. Small businesses closed. Informal markets expanded. Barter returned in some regions. Eggs for soap. Shoes for rice. By the late 2010s, remittances from relatives abroad became lifelines. Dollars flowed quietly through neighborhoods, creating parallel economies. Those with access to foreign currency survived more comfortably. Those without fell further behind. Inequality widened sharply, even as official rhetoric spoke of equality and revolution. All the while, the state grew more present and less capable. Subsidized food boxes arrived irregularly. Their contents varied. Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they did not. But they reinforced dependence. To receive them often required political compliance, or at least silence. Survival and loyalty blurred together. This is the point where the economic story becomes inseparable from power. As hardship deepened, protest followed. People marched not for ideology, but for food, for medicine, for dignity. The government responded with force. Demonstrations were dispersed. Leaders were detained. Fear settled into public space. And yet, the economic pressures did not ease. They compounded. I imagine a teacher, once respected, now selling belongings to afford groceries. A nurse skipping meals to feed her children. A young professional leaving the country with a single suitcase, uncertain if return would ever be possible. These individual decisions, repeated millions of times, reshaped Venezuela more profoundly than any decree. By the time international sanctions tightened later in the decade, the economy was already deeply damaged. The collapse did not begin with isolation. It preceded it. Sanctions worsened conditions, but they did not create them. The foundations had already crumbled. As I let this part of the story settle, the mood grows heavy but quiet. There is no single moment of failure, no dramatic explosion. Only a long unraveling, measured in empty shells and shrinking possibilities. In the calm that follows, we prepare to move deeper. In Part 3, I will guide you through the machinery of control that expanded alongside this collapse. How institutions were reshaped. How opposition was neutralized. How a government facing economic ruin learned to survive politically. For now, let the numbers fade. Let the shop doors close softly. Let the pencils be set down. We drift onward, carrying with us the understanding that when money loses meaning, everything else must be renegotiated. Part 3: Power Without Permission. As we continue gently forward, the sound of protest fades into something quieter but more enduring. Not the chants themselves, but the echo they leave behind. In this part of our story, the collapse of Venezuela's economy becomes only the backdrop. The true focus now is how power responded when consent began to disappear. I want you to imagine a government building at night. The lights are still on long after offices should be empty. Papers move between hands. Decisions are signed quietly, efficiently, and without ceremony. Outside, the city sleeps uneasily. This is how authority hardens, not always with spectacle, but with routine. When Nicolas Maduro first faced widespread unrest, his legitimacy was already fragile. His electoral victory had been narrow. His mandate was questioned. Economic hardship stripped away patience quickly. And so, rather than seek compromise, Maduro chose consolidation. Power, in his hands, would not ask to be renewed. It would be secured. The first arena of transformation was the judiciary. Courts that once operated with some independence increasingly aligned with the executive branch. Judges were appointed not for neutrality, but for reliability. Rulings followed predictable patterns. Challenges to government authority stalled or were dismissed outright. Legal language remained, but its spirit thinned. Then came the legislature. In 2015, opposition parties achieved a sweeping victory in Venezuela's National Assembly. It was a clear message from the electorate, one that might have forced negotiation in another system. Instead, it triggered an institutional standoff. The Supreme Court, loyal to the executive, invalidated the Assembly's authority piece by piece. Laws passed by elected representatives were struck down. Budgets were bypassed. The Assembly remained physically present, but functionally hollow. What emerged in its place was a parallel structure. A new Constituent Assembly, loyal to Maduro, was convened in 2017. It claimed sweeping powers. It replaced legislative oversight. It rewrote rules without broad participation. The original assembly still existed, but it no longer mattered. This was governance by substitution. As I sit with this moment, I am struck by how procedural it all was. There were no tanks in the streets during these transitions. No single dramatic coup. Just decrees, rulings, and announcements delivered with calm certainty. Power changed shape while maintaining the appearance of continuity. Beyond institutions, the security apparatus grew central. Protests, once tolerated, were reframed as threats. Demonstrators became saboteurs. Students became foreign agents. Neighborhood gatherings were monitored. Intelligence services expanded. Detentions increased. Many were brief. Some were not. The goal was not always punishment, but demonstration. A reminder that visibility carried risk. This atmosphere altered daily behavior. People learned when to speak and when to remain quiet. Conversations shifted indoors. Phones were watched carefully. Political discussion softened or vanished entirely. Fear does not always roar. Often it whispers. I think here of the role played by loyalty networks. The military was elevated, rewarded, and woven deeply into civilian governance. Officers held key positions in ministries, companies, and regional administrations. Their stake in the system grew. Stability for the regime became stability for them. This alignment made fractures less likely and enforcement more assured. Maduro did not rule alone. He ruled through layers. Media control followed a similar pattern. Independent outlets faced closures, fines, or ownership changes. Broadcast licenses were revoked. Journalists left the country or shifted to safer topics. State media expanded, filling the airwaves with official narratives. Information did not vanish entirely, but it became harder to find and easier to dismiss as rumor or foreign manipulation. Truth, like currency, lost a shared reference point. Internationally, condemnation mounted. Human rights organizations documented abuses. Foreign governments questioned elections. Diplomatic pressure increased. Maduro responded by tightening rhetoric. Venezuela, he insisted, was under siege. Every criticism was proof of conspiracy. Every sanction confirmed hostility. This framing mattered deeply. It allowed repression to be recast as defense. It turned survival into virtue. It narrowed the space for dissent until opposition itself could be described as treason. Inside the country, a new rhythm settled in. Elections continued, but their outcomes became predictable. Candidates were barred or disqualified. Rules shifted close to voting days. Observers were limited. Participation declined. Voting became ritual rather than choice. I pause here to reflect on how power feels from within such a system. It is not constant terror. It is fatigue. It is calculation. It is choosing battles carefully. It is learning that silence often carries fewer consequences than speech. And yet, resistance did not disappear. It adapted. It became quieter. Community support networks formed. Information traveled through informal channels. People helped one another survive even when institutions failed them. These acts rarely made headlines, but they mattered. At the center of all this stood Maduro, increasingly insulated. His speeches grew longer, more defiant. He appeared less responsive to criticism and more confident in endurance. Time, rather than approval, became his metric of success. Each year survived was a victory. Each challenge weathered was proof of legitimacy, or so the narrative claimed. This is where the brutality of the reign becomes most apparent. Not in constant violence, but in sustained constraint. In a system that limits possibility over years. In a governance style that prioritizes survival of power over well-being of people. As the night deepens, I let this part of the story rest. We have seen how economic collapse and political consolidation intertwined, reinforcing one another. Scarcity made control easier. Control made recovery harder. The cycle tightened. In Part 4, we will turn toward the human cost more directly. The prisons, the protests, the lives interrupted and altered. We will listen closely to how ordinary Venezuelans navigated a landscape shaped by fear, resilience, and quiet endurance. For now, remain still. Let the machinery fade into the background hum. We move onward, slowly, into the lives lived beneath it. Part 4, the cost paid in bodies and breath. As we move softly onward, the story narrows its focus. Power and policy fade slightly into the background, and what comes forward instead are people. Faces. Names spoken quietly. Lives that bent under pressure long before they broke. This is the part of the story where the brutality of rule is no longer abstract. It settles into bodies and breath. I ask you to imagine a street in Caracas just before dusk. The heat of the day has softened. The air feels heavy with anticipation. A small crowd gathers, not in celebration, but in necessity. They are students, pensioners, nurses, parents. They carry cardboard signs written in careful letters. Food, medicine, wages, dignity. These are not radical demands. They are survival requests. Under Nicolas Maduro, these gatherings increasingly met a familiar response. Security forces arrived in formation. Shields, helmets, tear gas canisters hanging from belts like tools rather than weapons. Orders were brief. The dispersal was swift. Gas bloomed across the street, burning eyes and lungs. People scattered, coughing, stumbling, helping one another into doorways and alleys. Sometimes there were arrests. Sometimes there were injuries. Sometimes there were deaths. The pattern repeated often enough that it became predictable. Predictability does not make violence gentler. It makes it heavier. I pause here to speak carefully. This is not a story told for shock. It is a story told for understanding. Because what happened in Venezuela during these years was not a single massacre or a brief crackdown. It was sustained pressure applied over time. Protests crushed again and again until participation itself felt dangerous. Detention became a tool of intimidation. Some were held for hours. Others for weeks or months. Charges were vague. Legal processes slow or absent. Families waited without information. Lawyers navigated a system that no longer pretended to neutrality. The uncertainty itself became part of the punishment. Inside detention centers, conditions varied, but reports were consistent enough to form a pattern. Overcrowding. Limited access to food and water. Interrogations designed to exhaust rather than extract. The goal was not always confession. It was compliance. International organizations took notice. Groups like Amnesty International documented cases of excessive force, arbitrary detention, and abuse. Their reports were detailed, methodical, and deeply unsettling. The government dismissed them as propaganda. The words did not change policy, but they preserved record. Record matters, even when justice is delayed. Beyond the streets and cells, fear reshaped everyday life. Parents warned children what not to say at school. Teachers avoided political topics. Workers lowered their voices in public spaces. Even social media became risky. Posts were deleted. Accounts went quiet. Silence spread not because people agreed, but because speaking carried cost. This quiet did not mean acceptance. It meant calculation. I think here of doctors in understaffed hospitals, working double shifts with minimal supplies. Speaking out risked dismissal or worse. Remaining silent meant watching preventable deaths. Many chose a third option. They left. Nurses emigrated. Physicians followed. Clinics emptied of expertise just when they were needed most. The exodus accelerated. By the late 2010s, millions of Venezuelans had left the country. They crossed borders on foot. They boarded buses with uncertain destinations. They carried documents in plastic bags and memories they could not pack away. Entire families fractured. Grandparents stayed. Children left. Communities thinned. This migration was not driven by ambition. It was driven by necessity. I imagine a mother standing at a bus terminal, watching her son depart. She knows the journey will be dangerous. She knows he may not return. But she also knows staying offers little future. This choice, repeated countless times, reshaped Venezuela more quietly than any election. Meanwhile, inside the country, those who remained adapted. Informal economies expanded. Community kitchens formed. Neighbors shared medicine. Churches opened doors. Survival became collective where institutions failed. These acts of mutual aid were not political statements, but they carried quiet resistance. They said life would continue even when systems collapsed. The state, however, remained watchful. Surveillance increased in subtle ways. Checkpoints appeared. Identification was required for basic services. Access to subsidized food or benefits often depended on registration in government databases. Participation implied compliance. Refusal risked exclusion. Hunger became leverage. This is a form of control that rarely looks dramatic. It operates through routine, through paperwork, through queues and lists. It does not need constant force because it embeds itself in daily survival. I pause again, allowing the weight of this to settle. Brutality is often imagined as sudden and violent. In Venezuela, it was also slow and administrative. A narrowing of options. A steady erosion of safety. Maduro's speeches during this time grew increasingly defiant. He spoke of endurance, of victory against enemies, of history watching. There was little acknowledgement of suffering unless it could be attributed to external forces. Responsibility was always elsewhere. And yet, despite everything, people endured. They found ways to laugh quietly, to celebrate birthdays with improvised cakes, to mark holidays with less but together, to keep routines alive even as circumstances deteriorated. This resilience is not romantic. It is exhausting. But it is real. As the night deepens, I bring this part to a gentle close. We have listened to the human cost of power held too tightly, to the breath burned by gas, to the silence learned for safety, to the footsteps moving away from home. In Part 5, we will look outward, to the international stage, to sanctions, diplomacy, and the strange balance of isolation and survival that followed. We will see how Venezuela's crisis rippled beyond its borders, shaping perceptions and alliances far beyond its streets. For now, remain still. Let the voices rest. Let the streets empty. We move onward, carrying with us the understanding that history is lived most deeply not in palaces, but in ordinary moments under extraordinary strain. Part 5: A Nation Watched from Afar. As we drift onward, the camera of this story pulls back. The streets of Caracas grow smaller. Borders come into view. And Venezuela, once spoken of mostly in terms of oil and revolution, becomes a focal point of global attention. This is the moment when the country's internal crisis spills outward, and the world begins to argue over what should be done about Nicolas Maduro. At first, the international response was cautious. Governments issued statements. Diplomatic missions expressed concern. Elections were questioned. Reports circulated. But concern alone does not shift power, and Maduro understood this well. He had learned, by this stage, that condemnation did not automatically translate into consequence. Still, pressure mounted. By the late 2010s, sanctions emerged as the primary tool of foreign response. Targeted sanctions were imposed against individuals within the Venezuelan government. Assets were frozen. Travel was restricted. Later, broader economic sanctions followed, particularly affecting the oil sector, along the heart of Venezuela's revenue. The intention, stated plainly, was to force political change by limiting access to resources. Inside Venezuela, the effects were complex. Maduro seized the narrative quickly. Sanctions became proof of siege. Every hardship, whether rooted in years of mismanagement or newly worsened by isolation, was attributed to foreign aggression. This framing resonated with some. It also hardened the loyalty of those whose positions depended on the regime's survival. Sanctions did not fracture the inner circle. They reinforced it. I imagine government meetings where the language of resistance replaced the language of reform. Survival was reframed as victory. Endurance became legitimacy. As long as Maduro remained in office, he could claim defiance. Each year that passed without collapse was proof, at least to his supporters, that the revolution lived. Meanwhile, the opposition looked outward as well, seeking recognition and leverage beyond Venezuela's borders. In 2019, a dramatic moment unfolded when opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself interim president, citing constitutional grounds. Several countries recognized him. Headlines surged. For a moment, it seemed as though a turning point had arrived. But inside Venezuela, little changed. The military did not defect in large numbers. Institutions did not shift allegiance. Maduro remained in the presidential palace. Guaido's recognition existed largely on paper and podiums abroad. Over time, the momentum faded. The opposition fractured. Hope, once briefly reignited, dimmed again. This episode revealed a crucial truth about Maduro's rule. External recognition mattered less than internal control. As long as the security forces, courts, and bureaucratic machinery remained loyal, international declarations could not dislodge him. The world, meanwhile, debated responsibility. Some argued sanctions worsened civilian suffering. Others insisted pressure was necessary to avoid legitimizing authoritarianism. Humanitarian exemptions were discussed. Aid corridors proposed. Each solution collided with political reality on the ground. Inside Venezuela, people adapted once more. Informal trade expanded across borders. Fuel and goods moved through unofficial channels. Alliances shifted quietly. Maduro sought new partners willing to engage despite sanctions. Economic relationships diversified, often in opaque ways. Transparency diminished further. Survival required flexibility, not openness. I pause here to reflect on how isolation reshapes a government. It does not always weaken it. Sometimes it simplifies its priorities. When approval from abroad is no longer expected, domestic control becomes paramount. Criticism can be dismissed. Standards can be lowered. Accountability narrows to a small circle. This narrowing was visible in Maduro's public posture. His speeches grew less conciliatory and more resolute. He spoke of sovereignty and resistance. He framed Venezuela as a symbol of defiance in a world dominated by powerful interests. For supporters, this narrative restored pride. For critics, it rang hollow against lived reality. The humanitarian dimension of the crisis drew increasing attention. International aid organizations attempted to deliver food and medicine. Efforts were politicized. Convoys were blocked. Aid became another arena of contest, another symbol contested by both sides. Even relief could not escape politics. Beyond Venezuela's borders, the migration crisis intensified. Neighboring countries absorbed millions of Venezuelans. Cities strained. Social services stretched. Tensions emerged. What had begun as a national crisis became a regional one. Venezuela's collapse reshaped demographics far beyond its own territory. And yet, despite this outward ripple, the core remained unchanged. Maduro endured. I think here of how time itself became a tool. Each year of survival eroded urgency abroad. Crises elsewhere demanded attention. Venezuela slipped from headlines. Sanctions remained, but enforcement fatigue set in. Diplomatic priorities shifted. The world moved on, even as Venezuelans could not. This fading spotlight mattered deeply. It allowed the regime to settle into a new normal. Not stability in the traditional sense, but equilibrium. A balance between scarcity and control. Between isolation and adaptation. Between repression and resignation. Inside the country, some conditions stabilized marginally. Dollarization spread informally. Certain goods returned at prices few could afford. Inequality deepened further. A thin layer experienced relative comfort while many remained in precarity. The revolution, once framed as egalitarian, now presided over stark division. Maduro presented this as recovery. As I let this part of the story rest, the mood is neither hopeful nor final. It is suspended. Venezuela stands watched, discussed, sanctioned, and debated, yet fundamentally unchanged in its political structure. Power remains concentrated. Accountability remains distant. The world's gaze flickers rather than fixes. In Part 6, we will return inward once more. To the everyday adaptations that followed. To how people rebuilt routines amid uncertainty. To the strange coexistence of collapse and continuation that defined life under Maduro's enduring rule. For now, let the borders remain visible. Let the voices from abroad quiet. We drift back toward the lives lived within, where history continues not in declarations, but in ordinary endurance. Part 6, Life Relearned in Fragments. As we move gently onward, the great political arguments soften into background noise, and what remains is life itself. Not the life that was promised, nor the life remembered from before, but the life that had to be relearned piece by piece. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela did not simply collapse and stop. It continued. Unevenly. Quietly. Improvisationally. I ask you to imagine a morning in Caracas some years into the crisis. The city wakes early now, not out of ambition, but necessity. Power outages make schedules unreliable. Water runs only at certain hours. People plan their days around utilities as much as jobs. When electricity returns, phones charge quickly. Laundry machines hum in brief windows of opportunity. Routine is built around uncertainty. This adaptation is one of the least discussed aspects of prolonged crisis. At first, disruption feels shocking. Over time, it becomes a framework. People stop asking when things will return to normal and instead ask what kind of normal can be constructed from what remains. Money, already unreliable, evolves further. Dollars circulate openly. Prices are quoted in foreign currency even when paid in local bills. Small plastic bags hold banknotes in thick stacks. The act of paying becomes almost ceremonial, careful and slow. Change is scarce. Trust between buyer and seller matters more than official rates. This informal dollarization does not bring equality. It creates layers. Those with access to remittances or foreign income move more freely. Those without remain constrained. Two economies coexist in the same streets, visible in restaurant menus, clothing, and transportation choices. And yet, people share space. I think of neighborhood bodegas reopening with limited stock, their owners calculating risk daily. Of mechanics repairing vehicles with scavenged parts. Of teachers offering informal lessons when schools falter. Of barbers cutting hair by daylight when power is out. Work does not disappear. It changes shape. Under Maduro's prolonged rule, survival becomes a skill set passed quietly from one person to another. Where to find medicine? Which pharmacies might have shipments? Which hospitals still function reliably? Which routes to avoid during protests or security operations? Knowledge circulates through whispered conversations and text messages, not official channels. Families reorganize. Households merge. Grandparents care for grandchildren left behind by migrating parents. Remittances arrive irregularly, stretched across many needs. Phone calls carry reassurance and guilt in equal measure. Distance becomes a permanent condition rather than a temporary one. I pause here to reflect on how endurance alters identity. People stop describing themselves by profession and start describing themselves by capability. Someone becomes good at finding food. Someone else knows how to navigate bureaucracy. Someone else can repair almost anything. Value shifts from status to utility. The government remains present in these daily lives, but not always visibly. Subsidized food programs continue intermittently. Identification systems track eligibility. Participation is framed as support. Refusal risks exclusion. For many, engagement is pragmatic rather than ideological. Survival demands flexibility. Maduro's speeches still echo through state media, but their relevance fades for ordinary people. Words matter less than outcomes. Promises are received with caution. Attention narrows to the immediate. What can be done today? What might be available tomorrow? This narrowing does not erase emotion. It concentrates it. There is grief, often unspoken. Grief for careers interrupted. For futures postponed. For relatives who left. for a sense of national trajectory that once felt forward. There is also pride, quieter but persistent, in adaptation, in keeping families fed, in maintaining dignity where possible. Cultural life does not vanish. It compresses. Music plays at gatherings. Holidays are marked modestly. Humor survives, often dark and understated. Laughter becomes a release valve, a reminder of shared experience. I think of children growing up within this landscape. For them, crisis is not an interruption. It is the baseline. They learn to navigate scarcity early. They understand cues. They absorb caution. Their expectations differ from those of previous generations. This generational shift may be one of the most enduring legacies of Maduro's era. Education continues unevenly. Some schools function. Others struggle. Teachers leave. Curricula thin. Students adapt, learning from peers, family, online resources when available. Knowledge becomes decentralized, fragmented, but not extinguished. Healthcare follows a similar pattern. Public hospitals remain strained. Private care exists but is expensive. Community solutions emerge. Informal networks share supplies. Doctors volunteer time. Outcomes vary widely. Access becomes a matter of connection and luck rather than entitlement. Throughout all this, the state's core structures remain intact. Elections occur. Ministries operate. Security forces patrol. The appearance of continuity persists even as lived reality diverges sharply from official narratives. This coexistence of formality and fragility defines the later years of Maduro's rule. I pause to consider how fatigue settles in. Not the sharp exhaustion of sudden crisis, but the dull weariness of sustained strain. People learn to conserve energy, to avoid confrontation when possible, to choose battles carefully. Protest becomes rarer not because grievances disappear, but because costs are too high. And yet, hope does not vanish entirely. It changes texture. Hope becomes smaller. It attaches to specific outcomes rather than sweeping change. A successful visa application. A shipment arriving. A child finishing school. A business surviving another month. These hopes are quieter, but they are real. Maduro's government benefits from this narrowing of expectation. When people hope for less, they demand less. Political pressure diffuses into private struggle. Control requires less force when exhaustion does part of the work. Still, resilience persists. I think of evenings when neighborhoods gather despite shortages. Of shared meals assembled from little. Of conversations drifting toward memory and possibility. Of people imagining futures elsewhere or different versions of home. These moments do not overturn systems, but they preserve humanity. As this part of the story settles, we see Venezuela not as frozen in collapse, but as moving sideways. Adjusting. Rebuilding in fragments. Living within limits imposed by politics, economics, and time. In Part 7, we will look more closely at the internal fractures that begin to emerge even within the regime itself. Power held too tightly strains its own foundations. Alliances shift. Trust erodes. Survival strategies evolve not only among citizens, but among those who rule. For now, let the morning routines continue. Let the generators hum briefly. Let the phones charge. Life, adapted and altered, moves quietly onward. Part 7. Cracks beneath the surface. As we drift a little further into the story, the focus shifts again. Not outward, not downward, but inward. Toward the quiet tensions that form when power is held for too long, under too much strain. Even the most tightly controlled systems develop fractures. Even loyalty, when demanded endlessly, begins to thin. This is the part of the story where the reign of Nicolas Maduro is no longer only about domination over society, but about constant negotiation within his own circle. Because while the streets of Caracas adjusted to survival, the halls of power adjusted to suspicion. Authoritarian systems often appear solid from the outside. They project unity. They speak in one voice. But internally, they are rarely calm. They are systems of balance, favors, and fear. Under Maduro, this balance became increasingly delicate. I ask you to imagine a long conference table in a government building. The room is air-conditioned, quiet, carefully guarded. Around the table sit ministers, military officials, party leaders. Their expressions are composed. Their words are measured. But beneath the surface, calculations are constant. Who still benefits? Who is losing ground? Who might be blamed next? Because crisis changes alliances. In the early years, loyalty to the Bolivarian project was ideological for some, personal for others. Over time, ideology faded as a motivator. Survival replaced belief. Positions within the state became not just roles, but shields. Losing office meant losing protection. In this environment, trust eroded even among allies. Maduro understood this instinctively. He reshuffled cabinets frequently. Ministers rose and fell with little explanation. Promotions were sudden. Demotions quiet. The message was clear. Power flowed from the center, and it could be withdrawn at any moment. Stability depended on proximity to the presidency, not on competence or public approval. The military remained central to this equation. Officers held control over key industries, logistics, and regional administration. Their loyalty was cultivated through access and privilege. But even within the armed forces, pressures mounted. Lower ranks felt the same economic strain as civilians. Families struggled. Morale became uneven. Leadership, aware of this, emphasized discipline and unity, while monitoring dissent carefully. In such systems, rumors matter as much as facts. Whispers circulated about internal disagreements. About corruption investigations used selectively. About rival factions maneuvering quietly. Few of these stories reached the public clearly, but their existence shaped behavior. Officials became cautious. Decisions slowed. Responsibility was deflected upward or outward. I pause here to reflect on how fear changes governance. It does not always produce chaos. Often it produces rigidity. Rules become less flexible. Innovation declines. Risk is avoided. Maintaining position becomes the primary goal. In Venezuela, this rigidity made policy adaptation difficult even when conditions demanded it. Economic reforms, long discussed, were implemented unevenly and without transparency. Some restrictions loosened quietly. Others remained. The lack of clear direction benefited those already embedded in informal systems, while leaving ordinary citizens uncertain. Within government, this ambiguity allowed deniability. Outcomes could always be blamed on external factors. Maduro's inner circle narrowed over time. Advisors came and went. Trust concentrated. Decision-making centralized further. This insulated leadership from criticism, but also from reality. Information arriving at the top was filtered, softened, or delayed. Bad news traveled slowly. Good news traveled quickly, even when exaggerated. This disconnect is dangerous for any government. I imagine moments when officials recognized problems but hesitated to speak openly. To raise concerns was to risk being seen as disloyal. Silence became safer. In this way, the system discouraged its own correction. International isolation added another layer of strain. Sanctions limited options. Diplomatic pressure reduced flexibility. Those within the regime who favored negotiation found fewer opportunities. Hardline voices gained influence. Survival narratives overpowered reformist ones. At the same time, opposition movements continued to fracture and reorganize. Some sought dialogue. Others rejected it. Maduro's government engaged selectively, using talks as pressure valves rather than pathways to change. Negotiations offered breathing room, not transformation. Inside the ruling party, generational divides emerged quietly. Younger officials, raised during crisis, viewed politics pragmatically. Older figures carried revolutionary rhetoric that no longer matched lived reality. This mismatch created tension, though rarely expressed publicly. I think here of how power ages. Not in years, but in relevance. Narratives that once inspired begin to feel recycled. Speeches echo earlier versions of themselves. Symbols lose resonance. The regime compensates by repeating them more loudly. And yet, despite all this strain, the system held. It held because collapse would be costly for those inside it. It held because alternatives remained uncertain. It held because fear of change rivaled dissatisfaction with the present. For many within the regime, continuity was the least dangerous option. This is a crucial insight into Maduro's endurance. His survival was not solely the result of repression. It was also the result of mutual dependency among those who governed. To break away was to risk everything. I pause, letting this complexity settle. It is tempting to imagine authoritarian systems as monolithic. They are not. They are fragile structures reinforced by caution and inertia. As this part of the story comes to rest, we see that while Venezuelan society adapted outwardly, the regime adapted inwardly. It tightened. It narrowed. It endured, but at the cost of flexibility and trust. In Part 8, we will look at the moments when this balance was tested most sharply. Elections under strain. Negotiations that promised change and delivered little. Turning points that seemed decisive, yet resolved into continuation. For now, let the doors of the conference room close softly. Let the voices inside lower. The cracks are there, beneath the surface, quiet but persistent. And we drift onward, listening closely. Part 8, The Ritual of Choice. As we continue onward, the story arrives at moments that look, at first glance, like turning points. Dates circled on calendars. Ballots printed. Campaign slogans repeated across familiar streets. Elections, in theory, are moments of renewal. Under Nicolas Maduro, they became something else entirely. Rituals performed not to invite change, but to manage it. I ask you to imagine election day in Caracas. The sun rises as it always does. Polling stations open. Voters arrive slowly, some out of conviction, others out of habit, some out of obligation. Posters hang slightly faded, promising stability, resistance, prosperity. The language feels familiar, almost recycled. The act itself continues, even as faith in its outcome has thinned. This is not the absence of democracy. It is its hollowing. Over the years of Maduro's rule, elections did not disappear. They multiplied. Presidential contests, parliamentary votes, regional races, referendums. On paper, Venezuela appeared participatory. In practice, each contest unfolded within constraints that shaped results long before ballots were cast. Opposition candidates were disqualified or barred. Parties lost legal status. Electoral rules shifted close to voting dates. Access to media was uneven. State resources flowed openly toward pro-government campaigns. Observers were limited or excluded. Turnout declined as expectations faded. And yet, the government insisted on legitimacy through process. This insistence mattered. It allowed Maduro to claim continuity, to speak the language of sovereignty and choice even as the substance eroded. Elections became shields, not gateways. They absorbed criticism by existing, even when outcomes were predictable. I pause here to reflect on how this feels to the voter. There is a quiet calculation that takes place. Does participation lend legitimacy or preserve voice? Does abstention register protest or fade into absence? These questions do not have clean answers. Many Venezuelans debated them deeply, repeatedly, often changing their minds from one election to the next. Some voted despite doubt. Others stayed home despite hope. In 2018, a presidential election crystallized these tensions. Key opposition figures were barred or imprisoned. Others boycotted the vote, arguing participation would legitimize a predetermined outcome. Maduro ran and won, claiming victory and continuity. International recognition was divided. Domestically, the result deepened polarization. The following year brought one of the most dramatic episodes of Maduro's rule. Opposition leader Juan Guaido invoked constitutional arguments to declare himself interim president, arguing that the 2018 election lacked legitimacy. Several countries recognized him. Streets filled briefly with renewed protest. Expectations surged. For a moment, history seemed to hold its breath. But institutions did not move. The military did not defect en masse. Courts did not shift. Maduro remained in the presidential palace. The momentum dissipated slowly, painfully. What followed was not resolution, but fatigue. This episode revealed something crucial about elections under Maduro. They were not the primary mechanism of power. They were performances led atop a system already decided elsewhere. Change would not arrive through ballots alone. Negotiations followed, then stalled. Talks were held abroad. Agreements were announced and quietly abandoned. Each round raised hopes, then lowered them again. Maduro's government used dialogue strategically, easing pressure without conceding control. The opposition fractured further, divided between engagement and rejection. I think here of how repetition dulls expectation. When each promised turning point resolves into continuation, people learn to protect themselves emotionally. Anticipation becomes dangerous. disappointment becomes routine. Over time, cynicism replaces outrage. This emotional shift is as significant as any institutional change. Maduro's government adapted its electoral strategy accordingly. Turnout became less important than control. Legitimacy was claimed through procedure rather than participation. Victory margins mattered less than endurance. Each election survived was another year secured. International observers continued to issue reports. Statements continued to be released. Sanctions remained. But elections proceeded on schedule. Time moved forward. Within Venezuela, some conditions shifted slightly. Informal dollarization brought limited stability. Certain goods returned to shelves. Urban pockets experienced relative calm. The government framed these changes as recovery, proof that the revolution had survived external pressure. For many citizens, these improvements felt uneven and fragile. They did not restore trust. They did not erase memory. They did not reopen pathways to political influence. Elections continued to ask for participation without offering agency. I pause again, letting the image of the ballot box rest. It is a powerful symbol, even when emptied of meaning. People approached it with conflicting emotions. Hope, resignation, anger, indifference. Each choice carried weight, even when outcomes did not. Maduro understood symbolism well. His speeches around elections emphasized sovereignty and resistance. Voting was framed as defiance against foreign interference. Abstention was framed as betrayal. The act of voting itself became politicized beyond policy or platform. In this environment, elections did not resolve conflict. They managed it. They provided moments for pressure to rise and then dissipate. They absorbed energy without redistributing power. This management is one of the quiet strengths of Maduro's system. As the night deepens, I bring this part to a gentle close. We have seen how choice became ritual, how participation became performance, how ballots existed without pathways. These moments look decisive from afar, yet resolved into continuation. In Part 9, we will turn toward the long view. How history remembers prolonged rule. How narratives are shaped while events are still unfolding. And how Maduro's Venezuela exists between collapse and normalization, suspended in an uncertain present. For now, let the polling stations close. Let the posters peel slowly from the walls. The ritual has been completed once more. And the story, unresolved, moves quietly onward. Part 9, Living Inside an Unfinished Story. As we drift further into the night, the story loosens its grip on dates and declarations and settles instead into something quieter. This is the part where history has not yet decided what it will call these years. There is no final chapter title. No clear turning point to mark with certainty. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela exists inside an unfinished sentence, suspended between collapse and normalization, between crisis and routine. I invite you to imagine a historian of the future standing in a library decades from now, paging through records of this era. They will see reports, statistics, speeches, resolutions. They will see photographs of protests and migration maps and inflation charts that rise like cliffs. But what will be hardest for them to capture is the texture of living while history is unresolved. Because living inside an unfinished story feels different than reading one. In Caracas, the present tense stretches endlessly. Days repeat with slight variations. Some mornings feel easier than others. Some weeks bring small reliefs. Others bring renewed strain. People stop waiting for an ending and start learning how to inhabit uncertainty itself. This is not resignation in the dramatic sense. It is adaptation layered so deeply it becomes identity. Maduro's rule, by this stage, is no longer defined only by what it has destroyed, but by what it has normalized. Scarcity becomes expected. Power outages become planned around. Political stagnation becomes background noise. When something does change, it feels almost disruptive. I think of how language shifts in such environments. Words like crisis and emergency lose sharpness. They become permanent descriptors rather than alarms. New phrases emerge instead. La lucha. Resolver. Inventor. To struggle. To make do. To invent solutions. These words carry less drama but more truth. The government, too, settles into this long middle period. Maduro appears more frequently in controlled settings than spontaneous ones. His speeches emphasize continuity and endurance. He presents himself not as a visionary, but as a survivor. This is a subtle but important shift. Leadership becomes less about promise and more about persistence. Opposition movements continue, but their tone changes. Grand mobilizations give way to smaller efforts. Legal challenges. International advocacy. Community organizing. The dream of immediate transformation recedes. Longer horizons replace urgency. I pause here to reflect on how prolonged rule reshapes memory. Younger Venezuelans grow up with no lived experience of a different political order. For them, Maduro's presidency is not an aberration. It is the baseline. Their reference points differ from those of their parents and grandparents. Expectations recalibrate accordingly. This generational shift is quiet but profound. Older generations remember stability, even prosperity. They remember functioning institutions and predictable futures. Younger generations remember improvisation and departure. They remember relatives abroad and digital connections replacing physical ones. Their sense of belonging stretches across borders by necessity. The state continues to function, but selectively. Some services improve marginally. Others remain strained. Informal solutions persist. The contrast between official narratives of recovery and lived experience remains sharp, but fatigue dulls confrontation. Many people stop arguing about politics not because it no longer matters, but because it consumes energy they need elsewhere. Maduro's endurance becomes a fact rather than a controversy. Internationally, Venezuela occupies an ambiguous position. It is no longer front-page news. It is referenced as a cautionary tale or a frozen conflict. Diplomatic engagement continues unevenly. Sanctions remain, but enforcement ebbs and flows. The crisis is acknowledged, but rarely prioritized. This fading attention has consequences. It allows the internal equilibrium to persist. Pressure eases without resolution. The system continues as it is because dismantling it would require sustained focus and risk that few external actors are willing to commit indefinitely. Inside the country, people mark time differently. Birthdays. Departures. Returns that may or may not be permanent. Success is measured in survival milestones rather than achievement milestones. Keeping a business open. Finishing school. Sending money home. These victories are quieter but deeply felt. I imagine a family gathered for a modest celebration. A cake made with substituted ingredients. Laughter that arrives easily once it starts. Conversation that avoids politics not out of fear but out of exhaustion. This scene contains both loss and persistence. Both absence and presence. This coexistence defines life inside an unfinished story. Maduro's government benefits from this normalization. When crisis becomes routine, outrage softens. When endurance becomes identity, disruption feels risky. Stability, even imperfect stability, begins to appeal. And yet, beneath this surface calm, dissatisfaction remains. It is not loud, but it is deep. It expresses itself in migration choices, in apathy, in private conversations. It does not vanish simply because it is quiet. History has not closed its account with Maduro's Venezuela. Outcomes remain open. Paths diverge in theory even if they appear constrained in practice. The future holds multiple possibilities, though none feel imminent. I pause here, allowing the story to breathe. This is not a moment of climax. It is a moment of suspension. A holding pattern sustained by adaptation, control, and time. In Part 10, we will begin to look backward even as the story continues forward. We will explore how narratives are constructed while events are still unfolding. How governments attempt to shape memory before history has finished writing. And how the story of Maduro's reign is already being told, contested, and archived in real time. For now, let the present remain unfinished. Let the night deepen without resolution. History, like those who live within it, continues to wait, quietly, for whatever comes next. Part 10. Writing memory before the ink dries. As we move softly onward, something subtle happens to the story. The present, still unresolved, begins to argue with the future. This is the part where memory is no longer something that waits patiently for time to pass. It is something actively shaped, contested, and prepared in advance. Under Nicolas Maduro, history does not simply happen. It is narrated while still unfolding. I ask you to imagine a classroom somewhere in Caracas. The walls are worn. The textbooks are shared. On the chalkboard, a lesson unfolds about sovereignty, resistance, and national dignity. The language is familiar, carefully chosen. It emphasizes struggle against external forces. It highlights continuity. It avoids rupture. This is not merely education. It is memory in preparation. Governments that endure long periods of crisis learn an important lesson. If the future cannot be controlled, the story of the past can be. Maduro's Venezuela entered this phase gradually. At first, narratives responded defensively to criticism. Over time, they grew more assertive. The collapse was reframed. The suffering was recontextualized. Responsibility shifted outward. Economic hardship, once blamed on mismanagement, became the product of economic war. Sanctions were not a complicating factor. They were the central explanation. The state did not fail. It was attacked. This framing offered coherence where reality felt chaotic. It also offered absolution. I pause here to reflect on why this matters. Memory shapes legitimacy. If a government can define how its era is remembered, it can justify its endurance even amid failure. Survival becomes success. Resistance becomes virtue. Duration becomes proof. Maduro's speeches increasingly leaned into this logic. He spoke not only to the present, but to an imagined future audience. To historians. To children yet to come. He framed his rule as a chapter in a longer struggle rather than a discrete administration. Individual suffering faded into collective endurance. Complexity simplified into narrative. Media played a crucial role in this process. State outlets emphasized themes of resilience and recovery. Images of scarcity were minimized. Images of defiance amplified. When improvement occurred, however limited, it was magnified. When conditions worsened, blame was reassigned. Over time, repetition gave these frames weight. Opposition narratives competed, but unevenly. Independent journalists documented reality carefully, but reach was constrained. Reports circulated online, often beyond borders. Inside the country, access varied. Information became fragmented, shaped by platform, geography, and risk. This fragmentation created parallel memories. One version of Venezuela emphasized resistance, sovereignty, and survival. Another emphasized collapse, repression, and loss. Both contained truth. Neither was complete alone. The gap between them widened over time, shaping how different communities understood the same events. I think here of how families remember differently across generations. A grandparent might speak of the revolution's early promises. A parent might speak of the moment things began to fail. A child might speak only of improvisation and departure. These memories coexist, sometimes uncomfortably. The state attempted to stabilize its version. National holidays were reframed. Symbols reinforced. Heroes emphasized. Villains identified. The present was anchored to selective moments from the past. This anchoring gave meaning, but it also constrained interpretation. Maduro's government understood that time could work in its favor. As years passed, urgency faded. New crises elsewhere captured attention. Venezuela's story settled into categories. It became a reference rather than a focus. In that space, narrative could consolidate. Internationally, the same process unfolded differently. Analysts debated causes. Policymakers weighed responses. Journalists revisited familiar angles. Over time, the complexity was often reduced to shorthand. Oil mismanagement. Sanctions. Authoritarianism. Migration. These labels helped explain, but they also flattened lived experience. Inside Venezuela, people navigated these narratives daily. They learned which versions were safe to repeat publicly, which belonged only in trusted circles, which were best left unspoken. Memory became contextual. It adjusted depending on audience. This adjustment is another quiet adaptation. I pause again, letting the idea settle. History is often imagined as something written after events conclude. In reality, it is shaped continuously. By speeches. By textbooks. By commemorations. By what is remembered and what is allowed to fade. Maduro's endurance allowed his government to influence this shaping more than a shorter administration might have. Longevity brings opportunity. Each additional year adds layers to the narrative. Failures blur into endurance. Promises recede. What remains is the fact of continuation. This does not erase suffering. It reframes it. I imagine future debates among Venezuelans about these years. Arguments over cause and responsibility. Over what might have been done differently. Over who should be blamed and who should be forgiven. These debates will not be settled quickly. They will unfold across decades, shaped by distance and disclosure. The records already exist. Reports. Testimonies. Data. But meaning will be assigned later, through collective reflection. Through memory filtered by time. For now, the ink is still wet. As this part of the story comes to rest, we stand at a threshold between present experience and future interpretation. Maduro's reign is already becoming history even as it continues. Its story is being written in real time, contested line by line. In Part 11, we will turn toward the personal again. Toward how individuals carry memory within themselves. How trauma and adaptation shape identity long after circumstances change. And how the human cost of prolonged rule persists beyond any official narrative. For now, let the chalkboard be erased slowly. Let the speeches fade into echo. Memory continues its quiet work, preparing stories that will be told long after the present has finally moved on. Part 11. What the body remembers. As we move gently onward, the story turns inward once more. Away from institutions and speeches, away from borders and ballots, and toward something quieter and more enduring. This is the part of the story that does not wait for historians or textbooks. It lives inside people. In muscle memory. In habits formed under pressure. In the way a room is scanned automatically, even when danger is no longer visible. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela did not only change politically or economically. It changed people at the level of instinct. I ask you to imagine an ordinary moment. A bus ride through Caracas. The road is familiar. The driver weaves through traffic with practiced ease. Nothing unusual is happening. And yet, bodies remain alert. Ears catch sudden sounds. Eyes track movement. Years of uncertainty have trained attention in ways that are difficult to unlearn. This is what prolonged instability does. It does not always announce itself as trauma. Often, it presents as vigilance. People learn to prepare for disruption automatically. To carry extra documents. To store water even when supply seems stable. To keep savings hidden in multiple forms. To memorize routes. To avoid patterns that draw attention. These behaviors persist even when conditions improve slightly. The body remembers what the mind would prefer to forget. I pause here because this kind of impact is often overlooked. Political analysis tends to focus on outcomes. Regime change or endurance. Economic indicators. Migration statistics. But beneath all of this lies something less quantifiable. The reshaping of nervous systems. Consider the child who grew up hearing protests outside the window. Who learned early what tear gas smells like. Who watched parents whisper when discussing politics. That child carries those lessons forward, even into safer environments. Caution becomes default. Silence becomes skill. Or consider the adult who waited in lines for hours, day after day. The way patience stretched thin. The way frustration had to be managed constantly to avoid confrontation. This repeated self-regulation leaves traces. It changes how anger is expressed or suppressed. Trauma does not always appear as memory. Sometimes it appears as habit. I think of those who left Venezuela and built new lives elsewhere. On the surface, they may seem unburdened. Jobs found. Homes secured. Children enrolled in schools. But certain reflexes remain. Anxiety when supply chains falter even briefly. Discomfort with uncertainty. A lingering sense that stability is temporary. These responses are not irrational. They are learned. Inside Venezuela, those who stayed experienced a different but related imprint. They learned endurance in place. How to continue despite loss. How to maintain identity amid erosion. How to laugh when laughter feels almost inappropriate. This resilience is often praised, but it carries cost. Constant adaptation leaves little room for rest. I pause to reflect on how this shapes community. Shared hardship can deepen bonds. Neighbors rely on one another. Trust builds in small circles. At the same time, scarcity strains relationships. Competition emerges. Resentment surfaces quietly. People navigate between solidarity and self-preservation daily. Maduro's long rule created conditions where both coexist. Mental health services struggle to meet rising needs. Professionals left the country. Clinics lacked resources. Many people turned inward instead. Or to family. Or to faith. Coping mechanisms varied widely. Some were healthy. Others less so. Alcohol use rose. Depression went untreated. Grief remained unresolved. And yet, people persisted. I think here of how identity adapts. Many Venezuelans began to define themselves not by nationality alone, but by experience. By survival stories. By what they endured and learned. This identity can be empowering. It can also become heavy. When suffering becomes central to self-understanding, it can be difficult to imagine futures not shaped by it. Maduro's government rarely acknowledged this dimension publicly. Emotional impact does not fit easily into political narratives. It cannot be redirected or reframed with slogans. It accumulates quietly, regardless of official messaging. Time does not automatically heal this kind of wound. It requires safety, stability, space to process. These were unevenly available. I imagine a quiet evening in a modest apartment. Electricity is on tonight. A family eats together. Conversation drifts toward ordinary topics. A television plays softly. For a moment, everything feels almost normal. And yet, a loud noise outside startles everyone. The reaction is immediate. Shoulders tense. Silence falls. Only after a pause does conversation resume. This is the body remembering. These moments do not make headlines. They do not appear in reports. But they are among the most lasting legacies of prolonged rule under strain. Long after policies change, these patterns can remain. I pause again, allowing this to settle gently. Brutality is not only what happens publicly. It is what lingers privately. It is the way fear teaches caution. The way uncertainty trains anticipation. The way survival reshapes expectation. And still, within all this, people create meaning. They form new rituals. Celebrate small joys. Mark time through shared moments. Humor persists, often dry and self-aware. art emerges quietly. Music, writing, storytelling. These are not escapes. They are responses. Ways of integrating experience rather than denying it. Children born during these years grow up absorbing both strain and creativity. They learn from adults who have adapted deeply. What they will do with that inheritance remains unwritten. As this part of the story draws to a close, we are left with something intangible but essential. An understanding that the cost of Maduro's reign cannot be measured only in economics or politics. It is carried in bodies, in reflexes, in emotional landscapes shaped by years of constraint. In Part 12, we will begin to look toward distance. Toward what happens when time and space separate people from these experiences. How memory softens or sharpens. How narratives change once immediate pressure lifts. And how the story of these years continues to evolve beyond their borders. For now, let the room remain quiet. Let the body settle, even if only briefly. The story continues, but it does so gently, carrying with it all that has been felt as much as all that has been said. Part 12, Distance changes the shape of memory. As we move softly onward, the story stretches across space. Not forward in time, but outward. This is the part where distance begins to work on memory, where the pressure of immediacy loosens, and experiences once lived hour by hour begin to rearrange themselves inside the mind. For millions of Venezuelans, this distance is literal. Borders crossed. New cities learned. Accents softened or sharpened. Lives rebuilt far from home. Under Nicolas Maduro, migration became not just an economic response, but a psychological one. Distance offered safety, but it also altered how the past was carried. I ask you to imagine a Venezuelan family living abroad now. The apartment is modest but stable. The refrigerator is full. The lights stay on. Children attend school without interruption. On the surface, the crisis appears resolved. And yet, the past remains close, arriving unexpectedly through memory. Distance does not erase experience. It rearranges it. For those who left Venezuela, the first months away often felt unreal. Stability seemed fragile. Scarcity had taught them to expect loss. When shelves remained stocked week after week, relief mingled with unease. The body, trained under strain, waited for disruption that did not come. Over time, this vigilance softened, but it did not disappear entirely. It transformed into comparison. Supermarkets became emotional spaces. A simple choice between brands could trigger grief. Not for the object itself, but for the absence once endured. For the dignity lost when choice vanished. I pause here, because this is where memory becomes layered. The mind begins to edit. Certain hardships fade. Others sharpen. Hunger becomes symbolic rather than visceral. Fear becomes contextual rather than constant. Distance allows reflection, but it also risks distortion. Some memories soften with time. Moments of solidarity glow brighter. Laughter shared during difficulty takes on warmth. Others sharpen painfully. Images of queues. Of hospitals without supplies. Of farewells at bus terminals. Distance gives these memories room to echo. Diaspora communities form, carrying shared understanding. Conversations slip easily into shorthand. A phrase. A look. A reference that needs no explanation. Within these circles, Memory is preserved collectively, reinforced through repetition and shared recognition. At the same time, distance introduces divergence. Those who stayed and those who left begin to remember differently. Experiences no longer align perfectly. Conversations become delicate. One speaks of survival through departure. Another speaks of endurance through staying. Both are valid. Both carry weight. But tension can emerge where stories no longer overlap fully. This divergence matters deeply for how history will be told. I think here of how exile has shaped narratives across history. Distance often sharpens critique. It also allows idealization. Some remember the homeland as it was before crisis. Others remember it only through loss. Both are incomplete alone. Maduro's government understood the symbolic power of the diaspora. It framed those who left as victims of foreign manipulation or economic war. At times, it dismissed their experiences. At other times, it sought their remittances quietly, benefiting from the financial lifeline without acknowledging its source. This contradiction is telling. Inside Venezuela, those who remained also experienced distance, but of a different kind. Distance from political agency. From global attention. From earlier versions of themselves. Their memory work happened in place, under constraint. They remembered cautiously. Selectively. Often privately. I pause to reflect on how memory behaves under pressure. When expression carries risk, memory retreats inward. It becomes personal rather than collective. It is shared only in trusted spaces. Over time, this creates gaps in public record that future historians will struggle to fill. Distance abroad allows memory to speak more freely. Stories are told openly. Accounts recorded. Testimonies shared. These narratives will shape how the world remembers Maduro's Venezuela, perhaps more than those produced inside it. And yet, even abroad, memory evolves. Children who left young remember little directly. They inherit stories second-hand. Their understanding is shaped by tone and emphasis rather than experience. For them, Venezuela exists partly as a story told by adults. A place both real and imagined. Their identity stretches across places they may not fully know. I think of parents deciding what to share and what to withhold. Wanting children to understand, but not to be burdened. Wanting them to remember without reliving. This selective transmission shapes generational memory profoundly. Over time, distance also introduces comparison. New political systems. New forms of stability. New frustrations. Some migrants grow more critical of Venezuela's past. Others grow more sympathetic to its complexity. Exposure to different realities reframes earlier judgments. This reframing can soften anger or intensify it. I pause again, letting this complexity settle. Memory is not static. It is negotiated constantly between experience and context. Distance changes the questions memory asks. Not what happened, but what it meant. Not how to survive, but how to integrate. For Maduro's Venezuela, this process has already begun. The story is no longer only told by those inside its borders. It is told by millions outside them, shaping global perception and future understanding. Inside the country, a quieter version of this process unfolds. As immediate pressures ease slightly for some, space opens for reflection. People begin to speak more openly in small ways. to revisit moments once too close, to reassess choices made under strain. This reassessment does not lead to uniform conclusions. Some feel anger, others resignation, others gratitude for endurance. Memory fractures along lines of experience, class, geography, and timing. And this, too, will shape history. As this part of the story draws to a close, we find ourselves suspended between places. Between inside and outside. Between past and present. Distance has altered the shape of memory, but it has not dissolved it. In Part 13, we will turn toward time more explicitly. Toward what happens as years pass and urgency fades. How accountability is delayed. How responsibility is debated. And how societies eventually decide what to do with unresolved chapters once the present finally releases its grip. For now, let distance do its quiet work. Let memory stretch and shift gently. The story continues, carried across borders, waiting to see how it will finally be told. Part 13, Time, Responsibility, and the Long Delay. As we drift onward, the story slows its pace and lengthens its shadow. Distance has reshaped memory, and now time begins to do its own quiet work. Time does not arrive with verdicts. It does not announce judgment. It stretches, it erodes, it rearranges priorities. Under Nicolas Maduro, years accumulated not as chapters neatly concluded, but as layers pressed one atop another, heavy with unresolved questions. I invite you to imagine a clock with no second hand. The minutes move, but without urgency. This is how accountability often feels after prolonged rule. Everyone agrees that something should happen, someday. Few agree on when, how, or by whom. The present keeps pulling attention back to survival, leaving the past waiting politely in the corner. Time delays responsibility in subtle ways. In the early years of crisis, the language of urgency dominated. Emergency measures. Immediate relief. Rapid response. As the years passed, urgency softened into endurance. Crisis became condition. And when a condition persists long enough, it begins to feel less like a failure and more like a landscape. This shift matters deeply for accountability. When everything is an emergency, responsibility is blurred. Decisions are made quickly. Mistakes are excused as necessity. When emergency becomes routine, those same mistakes harden into precedent. What was once temporary becomes permanent by repetition. In Venezuela, this process unfolded gradually. Decrees extended. Powers expanded. Oversight weakened. Each step was justified by the moment. Together, they created a system where responsibility dispersed upward and outward until it seemed to belong nowhere in particular. I pause here to reflect on how societies eventually reckon with such periods. History offers many examples. Some choose trials. Some choose truth commissions. Some choose amnesty. Some choose silence. Each path carries consequences. But before any of these decisions can be made, time must first create space. Space from fear. Space from immediate need. Space from the sense that speaking openly will make tomorrow harder. For many Venezuelans, that space has not yet fully arrived. Those still inside the country navigate daily realities that leave little energy for retrospection. Those outside carry memory, but often without power to act on it directly. International actors debate frameworks of accountability, but their leverage shifts with geopolitical winds. Time stretches, unresolved. Maduro's endurance complicates this further. Accountability is easier when power changes hands. When administrations end. When documents open. When insiders speak freely. Prolonged rule delays all of this. It keeps records sealed. It keeps witnesses cautious. It keeps narratives contested. And so, time passes without closure. I think here of how responsibility feels to individuals who lived through these years. Many ask themselves quiet questions. Could I have done more? Should I have stayed? Should I have left sooner? Should I have spoken? Should I have remained silent? These questions rarely have satisfying answers. They circle back on themselves, shaped by hindsight that did not exist in the moment. This personal reckoning runs parallel to the political one. Both are delayed. Both are incomplete. Within the government, time also reshapes responsibility. Officials rotate. Roles change. Some figures disappear from public view. Others remain. Institutional memory becomes selective. Decisions are attributed to collectives rather than individuals. Documentation fragments. The longer time passes, the easier it becomes to blur authorship. This is not accidental. It is structural. I pause again, letting the weight of this settle. Accountability requires clarity. Clarity requires records, testimony, and willingness. Time can either support this by allowing fear to recede, or undermine it by allowing memory to fade. Which outcome prevails is never guaranteed. Maduro's government often framed time itself as vindication. Each year survived became evidence of legitimacy. Each unresolved accusation became less urgent. The absence of immediate consequences was interpreted as proof that none were deserved. This logic is powerful precisely because it is quiet. It does not argue. It waits. Opposition movements struggled with this temporal dynamic. Mobilization is difficult to sustain indefinitely. Attention wanes. Energy disperses. New priorities emerge. What once felt intolerable becomes familiar, even if it remains unjust. I think of how anniversaries are marked. Early on, they bring renewed focus. Over time, they pass more quietly. Memory competes with the present. Life insists on moving forward, even when the past remains unsettled. This insistence is not betrayal. It is survival. And yet, unresolved chapters exert pressure. They surface unexpectedly. In debates. In art. In private conversations. In sudden moments of anger or grief. Time does not erase them. It redistributes them. I imagine a future moment when conditions shift enough to allow fuller reckoning. When documents emerge. When testimonies accumulate. When narratives collide openly. That moment may feel sudden, but it will be built on years of quiet accumulation. For now, Venezuela exists in the long delay. This delay shapes how the story is told. Without resolution, narratives compete. Responsibility is debated rather than assigned. The past is referenced but not settled. This ambiguity can be destabilizing, but it can also preserve complexity. I pause to consider how this complexity might matter later. Simplified histories are easier to teach and remember. They are also less accurate. Venezuela's recent history resists simplicity. It involves intention and inertia, choice and constraint, agency and fear. Time, if allowed to do its work carefully, can hold these contradictions rather than flatten them. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we stand at a crossroads without signposts. Accountability has not arrived, but neither has forgetting. Responsibility remains suspended, carried forward by memory, distance, and quiet expectation. In Part 14, we will look toward the possibility of change without rupture, toward gradual shifts rather than dramatic endings, toward how societies sometimes move forward not by closing chapters cleanly, but by learning to live differently with what remains unresolved. For now, let the clock continue without its second hand. Let time pass slowly, deliberately. The story is not finished. It is waiting, as so many are, for the conditions that allow it to finally speak in full. Part 14. Change without thunder. As we move gently onward, the story resists the temptation of drama. There is no sudden rupture here. No single night when everything breaks open. Instead, we arrive at something quieter, slower, and often overlooked. The possibility of change without thunder. Change that does not announce itself with crowds or declarations, but arrives gradually, unevenly, almost shyly, through small shifts in behavior and expectation. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela learned to live inside continuity. And within continuity, paradoxically, the seeds of change often appear not as events, but as adjustments. I ask you to imagine Caracas on an ordinary afternoon. Traffic hums. Vendors sell snacks. Children walk home from school. The scene is not triumphant, but it is functioning. For years, the narrative of Venezuela abroad has focused on collapse, and rightly so. But collapse is rarely absolute. Life, stubborn and adaptive, finds narrow channels through which to continue. This continuation can be mistaken for recovery. It can also be mistaken for acceptance. In truth, it is often neither. It is something more ambiguous. A recalibration of what is possible within constraint. Small changes begin to appear. Informal dollarization stabilizes prices slightly. Some businesses reopen, catering to those with access to foreign currency. Power outages become more predictable. Certain neighborhoods experience relative calm. None of this resolves the underlying political structure, but it alters the daily texture of life. These shifts matter because they change how people imagine the future. When survival is the only goal, imagination shrinks. When survival becomes manageable, even briefly, imagination cautiously re-emerges. People begin to plan again, though in modest ways. A renovation delayed for years is finally attempted. A child's education is mapped beyond the next semester. A business owner experiments with a new product. This is not optimism in the grand sense. It is provisional hope. Maduro's government presents these moments as proof of success. Speeches emphasize resilience and adaptation. The narrative shifts subtly from resistance to recovery. The revolution, it is said, has endured. The country is stabilizing. The worst is behind. For many citizens, this framing feels incomplete. Improvements are uneven. Inequality has widened. Access depends on connection and currency. Yet even skeptics notice the difference between total freefall and precarious balance. This is where change becomes difficult to name. Opposition movements struggle to respond to this ambiguity. Crisis once unified outrage. Stabilization, however fragile, complicates messaging. When conditions improve slightly for some, urgency fragments. Demands become more specific. Strategies diverge. I pause here to reflect on how gradual change challenges expectations shaped by dramatic narratives. We often expect transformation to be visible and decisive. We expect clear before and after. But many societies move differently. They shift weight from one foot to the other. They adjust posture before taking a step. In Venezuela, these adjustments occur beneath an unchanged political leadership. That contradiction is unsettling. How can life adapt while power remains static? How can endurance coexist with dissatisfaction? The answer lies in separation. Political structures and social practices do not always move together. People find ways to live even when systems fail them. This does not legitimize those systems. It simply reveals human capacity. Maduro's endurance benefits from this separation. As daily life stabilizes slightly, pressure eases without resolution. The absence of catastrophe is framed as achievement. The lack of collapse becomes success. Yet beneath this surface, deeper questions remain unresolved. Political participation remains constrained. Institutions remain hollowed. Accountability remains delayed. These structural realities do not disappear because groceries are easier to find or power is more reliable. I think here of how societies sometimes choose the least disruptive path forward. Not because it is just, but because it is survivable. Dramatic change carries risk. Gradual adaptation feels safer, even if it preserves injustice. This choice is rarely made consciously. It emerges from fatigue. People who have lived through years of instability are cautious with hope. They have learned that sudden shifts often bring new costs. Incremental improvement feels manageable. It allows life to continue without demanding confrontation that could reopen wounds. And yet, this caution also carries cost. It can normalize limitation. It can shrink the horizon of what is considered achievable. Over time, people may adjust not only their routines, but their expectations. I pause, letting this tension breathe. Change without thunder can preserve peace, but it can also preserve power. In Venezuela, this dynamic creates a strange coexistence. On one level, people adapt and rebuild fragments of normalcy. On another, the political system remains largely unchanged. Both realities are true at once. This coexistence shapes the next generation. Young people growing up now encounter a Venezuela different from the one their parents describe, yet still constrained. They learn to navigate opportunity and limitation simultaneously. Their relationship to politics may be pragmatic rather than idealistic. They may seek change through personal mobility rather than collective action. This does not mean disengagement. It means redirection. Maduro's government, meanwhile, continues to emphasize stability. Stability becomes the central promise. Not prosperity. Not justice. Stability. After years of chaos, this promise carries weight. But stability without accountability is fragile. It relies on continued adaptation rather than resolution. It postpones rather than answers. I imagine a quiet conversation between neighbors. They speak of conditions improving slightly, of things being easier than before. Then someone adds, softly, that it should not have taken this long. That it should not have cost so much. The conversation trails off. Both truths remain. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we are left with an uneasy calm. Change has arrived, but it is partial. Life continues, but under limits. Power remains, but under scrutiny that has not vanished, only quieted. In Part 15, we will turn toward the question that lingers beneath all of this. What does it mean to rebuild trust after prolonged rule? Trust in institutions. Trust between citizens. Trust in the idea that the future can be shaped collectively rather than endured individually. For now, let the afternoon settle into evening. Let the streets remain calm, not because justice has arrived, but because people have learned how to breathe within the space available. Change, without thunder, continues its slow and uncertain work. Part 15, The Fragile Architecture of Trust. As we drift onward, the story settles into a question that lingers beneath every adjustment and adaptation. It is quieter than protest and heavier than fatigue. It asks not how to survive, but how to believe again. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela did not only lose material stability. It lost something more delicate and difficult to restore. Trust. Trust is not loud. It does not march or chant. It is built slowly, through repetition, consistency, and consequence. It depends on the expectation that tomorrow will resemble today in reasonable ways. When that expectation breaks repeatedly, trust withdraws. Not dramatically, but cautiously, step by step. I ask you to imagine an ordinary interaction in Caracas. A person stands at a public office window, paperwork in hand. They have learned to bring extra copies. To arrive early. To expect delays. They do not assume hostility, but they do not expect help either. Neutrality is the best they hope for. This posture, learned over years, reflects something profound. Trust has narrowed to function, not faith. This narrowing is widespread. Citizens learn not to expect institutions to work for them. They learn instead to work around institutions. They find intermediaries. They rely on personal networks. They trade favors quietly. None of this requires malice. It is adaptation to inconsistency. But each workaround weakens the idea of shared systems a little more. Trust between citizens also shifts. Scarcity strains generosity. People become careful about what they share and with whom. At the same time, small circles of trust deepen. Families, neighbors, colleagues. These micro-networks become lifelines. The nation, as an abstract collective, feels distant. The immediate community feels real. This reorientation is understandable. It is also costly. I pause here to reflect on how trust functions like infrastructure. When it is present, it is invisible. When it fails, everything becomes heavier. Transactions slow. Cooperation thins. Suspicion fills gaps where assurance once lived. Under Maduro's long rule, many Venezuelans learned to navigate without relying on trust in authority. They learned to assume that rules might change without notice. That promises might not be kept. That accountability might not arrive. This learning was rational. It was protective. It was also corrosive over time. Rebuilding trust after such periods is not a matter of declaration. It cannot be commanded. It cannot be legislated into existence. It must be earned repeatedly, in visible ways, over long stretches of time. Maduro's government emphasized stability, but stability alone does not rebuild trust. Stability without transparency can even deepen skepticism. When outcomes improve slightly but explanations remain opaque, people learn to enjoy relief without believing in cause. I think here of how people speak about improvements. They say things are better now, but they hesitate to say why. They do not attribute change to policy or leadership. They treat it as temporary, conditional, almost accidental. This hesitation reveals a deeper truth. Trust has not returned, even when conditions ease. Opposition movements face their own trust challenges. Years of failed mobilization and fractured leadership have left scars. Promises unmet erode credibility. Strategies debated endlessly without result exhaust supporters. Trust is fragile here as well. This dual erosion creates a vacuum. In that vacuum, cynicism can thrive. Not loud cynicism, but quiet disengagement. People stop expecting collective solutions. They focus on personal exit strategies or localized survival. This shift is one of the most enduring legacies of prolonged instability. I pause again, because this is where the story touches something universal. Trust is not only political. It shapes how people imagine cooperation itself. When trust recedes, imagination shrinks. People ask not what we can build together, but what I can secure alone. And yet, trust does not disappear entirely. It relocates. I think of grassroots initiatives, community kitchens, informal education programs, neighborhood watch groups, mutual aid networks. These efforts rebuild trust horizontally, even as vertical trust remains low. They demonstrate capacity for cooperation, but within limited scope. This localized trust is powerful, but it cannot replace institutions entirely. It can sustain life. It cannot, alone, govern a complex society. For that, broader trust must eventually be restored. Maduro's endurance complicates this restoration. When leadership remains constant despite crisis, people learn that trust is optional for power. Authority does not require belief to persist. This lesson undermines incentives for reform. Why rebuild trust if control suffices? At the same time, the absence of trust limits what power can achieve. Policies face skepticism. Compliance is partial. Innovation stalls. Governance becomes maintenance rather than development. I imagine a future scenario where conditions improve further. Infrastructure stabilizes. Markets function more reliably. Yet people remain cautious. They save rather than invest. They plan short-term. They hesitate to commit. Without trust, progress remains shallow. This is the quiet bind Venezuela faces. Rebuilding trust would require visible accountability, consistency over time, and inclusion of voices long marginalized. It would require acknowledging harm rather than reframing it. These steps are difficult under any circumstances. They are especially difficult under prolonged rule that has relied on endurance rather than consent. I pause, letting the complexity settle gently. Trust is not restored by forgetting. It is restored by recognition. By naming what was lost and how. By demonstrating change through action rather than rhetoric. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we sit with a fragile architecture. Trust has been damaged, but not erased. It survives in fragments, in communities, in shared memory of cooperation under strain. Whether it can be scaled again remains uncertain. In Part 16, we will turn toward the future as possibility rather than plan. Toward the way societies imagine what comes next when certainty is scarce. Toward hope that is cautious, provisional, and deeply shaped by what has been endured. For now, let the public office window close gently. Let the paperwork be gathered carefully. Trust waits, not loudly, but patiently, for reasons to return. Part 16, Imagining a Future Without Certainty. As we move softly onward, the story reaches toward something delicate. Not a plan, not a program, not a promise carved into stone, but imagination itself. After years of endurance, imagination becomes both necessary and risky. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela learned how to survive without guarantees. Now the question that drifts through the quiet is not what will happen next, but what people dare to imagine might happen at all. I ask you to picture an evening in Caracas. The light softens. Shops close their shutters. Generators hum briefly, then fall silent. Families gather for dinner, modest but warm. Conversation moves carefully. Someone mentions a plan for next month. Another smiles and says, "Let's see." This phrase carries more than hesitation. It carries history. Uncertainty has taught restraint. For years, imagining the future meant risking disappointment. Plans unraveled. Expectations collapsed. Promises, both official and personal, proved fragile. Over time, many learned to keep imagination small and flexible. Not because hope disappeared, but because hope became something to handle gently. This cautious imagination defines the present moment. People imagine futures in fragments. A job that lasts 6 months. A visa application submitted without certainty of approval. A business experiment that might work briefly. A child's education planned 1 year at a time. These are not dreams of transformation. They are dreams of continuity without catastrophe. I pause here to reflect on how different this is from earlier eras. Once, Venezuelan political imagination was expansive. Oil wealth promised modernization. Social movements promised inclusion. The future felt wide. Under prolonged crisis, that width narrowed. Now imagination bends inward, focused on resilience rather than ambition. This does not mean aspiration is gone. It means it has changed shape. Among younger generations, imagination often points outward. They imagine futures in other countries, other systems, other possibilities. Their connection to Venezuela remains emotional, familial, cultural, but their sense of where a future might unfold is more mobile. This mobility is both opportunity and loss. For those who remain, imagination turns practical. How to stabilize a household. How to support aging parents. How to build something small that endures. Political imagination recedes not because people stop caring, but because caring feels costly. Maduro's government, in this context, offers a particular vision of the future. It is a future of stability through continuity, of incremental normalization, of sovereignty maintained against pressure. This vision is intentionally modest. It promises endurance, not transformation. For some, this is appealing. After years of chaos, modest promises feel safer. For others, it feels suffocating. A future that asks only for patience without offering agency can feel like a prolongation of the present rather than a departure from it. I think here of how societies imagine change when certainty is scarce. Often, they do so indirectly. Through culture. Through small experiments. Through shifts in everyday practice. Change begins not as a revolution, but as a different way of relating to possibility. In Venezuela, these shifts are subtle. Informal civic initiatives emerge quietly. Independent cultural spaces reopen cautiously. Education adapts through alternative formats. None of this challenges power directly. But it preserves the capacity to imagine collectively, even in limited ways. Imagination also lives in memory. People imagine futures by referencing pasts. Not to return to them exactly, but to recover elements lost. Dignity. Predictability. Voice. These values surface in conversation, even when politics is avoided explicitly. I pause again, letting this gentle tension settle. Imagining a future without certainty requires balance. Too much optimism feels naive. Too little feels paralyzing. Most people navigate somewhere in between, adjusting hope to circumstance. This navigation shapes behavior. People invest cautiously. They diversify risk. They maintain exit options. These strategies are rational responses to uncertainty. They also reinforce it. When everyone plans for contingency, collective commitment becomes harder. Maduro's endurance has normalized this stance. The future is something to be managed, not seized. This normalization stabilizes the present while constraining ambition. And yet, imagination persists. I think of conversations held late at night, when caution relaxes slightly. People speak of what they would like to see change. Not in slogans, but in specifics. Schools functioning reliably. Hospitals stocked. Elections that feel meaningful. These desires are not abstract. They are grounded in lived experience. The fact that these conversations continue matters. It means imagination has not been extinguished. It has been deferred. Time plays a role here. As years pass, new cohorts come of age with different reference points. Their imagination may be shaped less by rupture and more by adaptation. This could produce pragmatism. It could also produce impatience. The direction is not predetermined. Maduro's government appears aware of this generational shift. Messaging increasingly targets youth, emphasizing opportunity within continuity. Whether this resonates depends on whether lived experience aligns with narrative. I pause to consider the nature of hope under these conditions. Hope is no longer an expectation of rapid change. It is a willingness to remain open. To imagine improvement without demanding certainty. To invest emotionally in small possibilities. This form of hope is quiet, but resilient. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we stand not at a conclusion, but at a threshold of imagination shaped by restraint. The future remains uncertain, but it is not unimagined. It exists in fragments, in conversations, in cautious plans, in choices made with both memory and possibility in mind. In Part 17, we will look toward endurance as legacy. How prolonged rule leaves marks not only on institutions and people, but on the rhythm of national life itself. How societies carry forward the tempo set by years of strain, even as circumstances shift. For now, let the evening settle. Let plans be made softly, without guarantees. Imagination remains alive, careful and persistent, waiting for conditions that allow it to stretch a little further. Part 17. The Rhythm That Remains. As we move gently onward, the story begins to listen for something less visible than policy and more enduring than promise. It listens for rhythm. The tempo set by years of strain, adaptation, and endurance. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela learned a particular pace for living. Not hurried, not free, but measured carefully against uncertainty. Long after circumstances shift, this rhythm remains. I invite you to imagine a morning in Caracas. The city wakes without urgency. People move with practiced timing. They know when the water might run, when traffic thickens, when lines form. This knowledge is not written anywhere official. It lives in bodies and habits. It is passed quietly from one person to another. Rhythm is memory in motion. Years of instability taught people when to rush and when to wait. They learned that speed could be dangerous and delay could be protective. They learned to keep options open, to avoid sharp commitments, to leave space between intention and action. Over time, these lessons shape daily cadence. Even as conditions stabilize slightly, this cadence persists. I pause here to reflect on how nations carry rhythm forward. Long wars leave behind tempos of vigilance. Long shortages leave behind tempos of conservation. Long authoritarian periods leave behind tempos of caution. These rhythms do not disappear when laws change or leaders leave. They linger, shaping how people respond to opportunity. In Venezuela, endurance became the dominant rhythm. Not triumph, not collapse, but persistence. This endurance is often misunderstood. From afar, it can look like acceptance. From within, it feels like careful breathing. Inhale when space opens. Exhale when pressure returns. Maduro's prolonged rule reinforced this rhythm by rewarding predictability over initiative. Stability, even imperfect stability, became valuable. Disruption carried risk. Over time, people learned to synchronize with the system's tempo rather than resist it openly. This synchronization is not consent. It is adaptation. I think of workplaces that function around irregular supplies. Of schools that adjust calendars to outages. Of hospitals that triage constantly. These institutions do not wait for permission to adapt. They do so because life requires it. Their rhythms align with reality rather than regulation. At the same time, this alignment constrains ambition. When rhythm centers on endurance, expansion feels risky. People hesitate to scale projects. They prefer to maintain what exists rather than grow beyond it. This conservatism is rational. It is also limiting. I pause again, letting the idea settle. Rhythm shapes expectation. Expectation shapes choice. Over time, these choices aggregate into culture. Maduro's era has already left its cultural tempo. Conversations move cautiously. Plans include contingencies by default. Celebrations are modest. Success is defined as continuity rather than ascent. These patterns are not easily reversed. And yet, rhythm is not destiny. I think of moments when rhythm shifts briefly. A festival returns after years of absence. A concert draws a crowd. A neighborhood organizes a cleanup. For a moment, tempo quickens. Laughter rises. Possibility stretches. Then the moment passes, and the older rhythm resumes. These flashes matter. They reveal that alternative tempos remain possible, even if not sustained yet. The challenge for any future transition will be to recognize this inherited rhythm rather than deny it. Sudden acceleration can exhaust a society trained in endurance. Demands for immediate transformation may clash with habits formed under caution. Healing requires pacing as much as vision. This insight is often overlooked. Political transitions that ignore rhythm risk alienation. They ask people to move faster than their trust allows. In Venezuela, where trust has been worn thin, any future change will need to honor the tempo people have learned to survive within. Maduro's endurance complicates this further. As long as leadership remains unchanged, the rhythm continues to be reinforced. Each year without rupture confirms caution as wisdom. Each avoided crisis validates restraint. But rhythms can evolve gradually. I imagine small shifts accumulating. A year with fewer outages. A school year completed without interruption. A business operating predictably. These experiences recalibrate tempo slowly. They teach bodies that steadiness is possible. That vigilance can soften slightly. Over time, these recalibrations can allow rhythm to change without shock. I pause to reflect on the legacy of prolonged rule in this sense. Beyond institutions and policies, it leaves behind a pace for living. A collective sense of how quickly one can move, how loudly one can speak, how firmly one can hope. This pace will shape Venezuela's future as much as any constitutional reform. It will influence how people engage politically, how they invest economically, how they rebuild trust. If rhythm remains cautious, progress will be incremental. If rhythm accelerates too quickly, backlash may follow. The balance will be delicate. I think of the metaphor of a long night ending. Eyes adjust slowly to dawn. Sudden light can be painful. Gradual illumination allows sight to return gently. Venezuela's rhythm reflects years spent adjusting to darkness. Dawn, when it comes, will need patience. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we recognize endurance not only as survival, but as tempo. A way of moving through time shaped by necessity. This rhythm is neither virtue nor vice. It is inheritance. In Part 18, we will turn toward endings that are not endings. Toward how prolonged eras conclude quietly, often without clear markers. Toward how societies realize change has occurred only after they are already living within it. For now, let the morning continue at its measured pace. Let footsteps remain careful. Rhythm holds the story together, carrying forward all that has been endured, waiting for the moment when it can finally change its beat. Part 18, when the ending arrives quietly. As we move gently onward, the story approaches something that does not announce itself. Not an ending in the cinematic sense, not a curtain call or a decisive rupture, but a quiet alteration of atmosphere. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela learned that eras do not always end with declarations. Sometimes they loosen their grip slowly, almost imperceptibly, until people realize they are living inside something slightly different than before. I ask you to imagine Caracas late at night. The streets are calmer than they once were. Not because justice has arrived, but because exhaustion has settled. Shops close on time. Buses complete their routes. The city breathes in a steadier rhythm. Nothing dramatic happens. And yet, something has shifted. This is how many prolonged periods conclude. Not with thunder, but with a subtle easing. For years, the defining feature of life had been intensity. Crises followed one another closely enough to blur. Inflation spikes. Protests. Crackdowns. Shortages. Migrations. Each demanded attention. Over time, intensity itself became the story. When intensity fades, even slightly, the absence feels notable. People notice first in their bodies. Sleep comes easier on some nights. Startled responses soften. Planning extends a little further forward. These changes are not celebrated. They are observed cautiously, as if naming them might reverse them. I pause here because this is where interpretation becomes delicate. A quiet easing can be mistaken for resolution. It can also be dismissed as illusion. Often, it is neither. It is transition without ceremony. Maduro's long rule created conditions where change, if it comes, is likely to arrive this way. Institutions have been reshaped gradually. Expectations recalibrated. When a system endures long enough, its eventual alteration tends to be incremental rather than explosive. This incrementalism frustrates those who seek justice quickly. It also spares societies the shock that sudden rupture can bring. Both truths coexist uneasily. I think here of how people recognize endings in their own lives. Not the day something officially ends, but the day it stops occupying every thought. The day urgency gives way to routine. The day fear loosens its grip. These are not anniversaries. They are sensations. In Venezuela, many people have begun to sense these subtle changes, even as structural power remains. The state continues to govern. Leadership continues. But the atmosphere has altered. The crisis no longer dominates every conversation. Other topics re-emerge. Ordinary concerns reclaim space. This does not mean suffering has ended. Inequality persists. Migration continues. Political constraints remain. But the emotional monopoly of crisis weakens. Life widens slightly. I pause again to reflect on how this widening affects perception of the past. When pressure eases, memory reorganizes. Events that once felt immediate become chapters rather than present tense. Anger softens into reflection. Grief finds language. Distance allows naming. This is often when societies begin to process what they have endured, even without formal reckoning. Maduro's government may interpret this easing as validation. Stability becomes proof of correctness. Endurance becomes success. The absence of collapse is framed as victory. This narrative competes with others, but it gains traction when fear recedes. For citizens, the interpretation is more complex. Some feel relief without gratitude. Others feel uneasy, wary that calm is temporary. Many hold both feelings at once. I imagine a conversation between friends. One says things feel better now. Another responds, yes, but remember how quickly it changed before. Both are right. The past teaches caution. The present invites tentative optimism. This coexistence defines quiet endings. I think also of how international attention responds to such shifts. Crises draw headlines. Stabilization draws silence. When urgency fades, scrutiny follows. This can benefit entrenched power. It can also allow space for internal processes to unfold without constant external pressure. Again, both truths exist. I pause to consider the role of time here. Time allows systems to adjust without spectacle. It also allows accountability to be deferred. Quiet endings can preserve ambiguity. They leave questions unanswered. They allow narratives to harden before evidence is fully examined. For future historians, this will be challenging. Where does the era end? On which date? With which event? The answer may be unsatisfying. The era may dissolve rather than conclude. People living through it often sense this before they can articulate it. They feel the story slipping from urgency into memory. They notice that conversations no longer begin with crisis updates. They notice that daily life no longer feels suspended. This noticing matters. I pause again, letting the quiet settle. Endings without markers require attention. They can be missed if one looks only for spectacle. They reveal themselves through rhythm changes, emotional shifts, and re-emerging normalcy. Maduro's endurance has shaped the conditions for such an ending, should it come. By stretching crisis over years, he has also stretched its resolution. The result is not catharsis, but diffusion. This diffusion has consequences. Without a clear ending, accountability may be partial. Memory may fragment. Responsibility may remain contested. At the same time, healing may be gentler, less abrupt, more integrated into daily life. I think of a metaphor of weather. A storm that rages briefly leaves visible damage. A drought that lasts years reshapes landscapes quietly. When rain finally returns, the change is subtle. Plants respond gradually. The land adjusts. The drought ends not with celebration, but with slow recovery. Venezuela's recent history resembles the latter. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we stand inside a moment that feels transitional without declaration. The crisis has not vanished. The system has not transformed. And yet, the air feels different. In Part 19, we will turn toward reflection as inheritance. Toward how societies pass down understanding of prolonged eras to those who did not live through them fully. Toward what is remembered, what is simplified, and what is deliberately carried forward. For now, let the night remain calm. Let the city breathe steadily. The ending, if it is coming, does so quietly, asking not to be announced, only to be noticed. Part 19. What is carried forward? As we drift softly onward, the story turns toward inheritance. Not inheritance of property or power, but of understanding. This is the part where a prolonged era begins to pass its weight to those who did not fully live inside it, or who lived inside it without yet having words for what it meant. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela accumulated experiences that will not remain contained within dates. They will be carried forward, translated, simplified, argued over, and retold. I ask you to imagine a conversation between generations in Caracas. An older person speaks of lines that stretched around blocks, of wages that vanished between morning and evening, of nights spent listening for unrest. A younger listener nods, attentive, but their own memories are different. They remember adaptation more than rupture. They remember normalcy built from constraint. The two stories overlap, but they do not align perfectly. This is how inheritance works. history does not pass cleanly from one generation to the next. It is filtered through language, emotion, and context. What one generation experienced as emergency, another receives as background. What felt unbearable to some becomes ordinary to others. This does not diminish suffering. It changes how it is understood. I pause here to reflect on how societies decide what to pass on. Some lessons are emphasized deliberately. Others fade unintentionally. Often, what is carried forward is not a precise account, but a mood, a warning, a posture toward authority or risk. In Venezuela, one of the strongest inheritances from these years is caution. Young people learn, sometimes without being told, that systems can fail and continue anyway. That stability is not guaranteed. That planning requires flexibility. This lesson can foster resilience. It can also foster skepticism toward collective promises. Parents, conscious of this, often struggle with how much to explain. They want children to understand what happened without being burdened by it. They want to pass on wisdom without passing on fear. This balance is delicate. I think here of stories told at family gatherings. Not lectures, but anecdotes. The time when electricity went out for days. The improvised meals. The neighbor who helped. These stories emphasize endurance rather than outrage. They teach survival more than critique. Over time, these narratives shape values. Self-reliance. Mutual aid. Pragmatism. Wariness of authority. These are not inherently political values, but they influence political behavior later. Maduro's long rule ensured that these lessons were learned slowly and repeatedly. This repetition makes them stick. I pause again, because inheritance is not only what is taught. It is also what is left unsaid. Silence carries meaning too. Some experiences remain difficult to articulate. Detentions. Fear. Complicity born of necessity. These stories may be withheld, not out of shame, but out of protection. Over time, gaps appear in collective memory. Future generations sense absence without knowing its shape. This absence can lead to simplification. Narratives harden into binaries. Heroes and villains. Causes and effects. Such simplification makes history easier to tell, but less accurate. It risks flattening lived complexity into slogans. I think of how this process unfolds elsewhere. Prolonged eras often become symbols rather than experiences. The danger is that symbols can be appropriated, reshaped to serve new agendas. In Venezuela, competing narratives already exist. Some frame these years as heroic resistance. Others as catastrophic misrule. Both narratives will be inherited selectively, depending on who tells them and why. The work of future generations will be to navigate between these frames, to recover nuance where possible. I pause to consider the role of institutions in this inheritance. Schools. Media. Museums. Archives. These spaces determine what is formalized as history. Under prolonged rule, these institutions often reflect power. Their accounts may emphasize continuity and legitimacy. Alternative accounts may circulate informally. As time passes, access to documents and testimony may expand. Or it may remain constrained. The shape of inheritance depends on this access. Outside Venezuela, the diaspora will play a significant role. stories carried abroad will return through writing, film, conversation. These accounts will interact with domestic narratives, sometimes clashing, sometimes complementing. This exchange will be uneven. Distance allows freedom of expression. It also risks detachment from current realities. Those inside the country may view diaspora narratives as outdated or incomplete. Those abroad may view internal narratives as compromised. Bridging this gap will take time. I pause again, letting the complexity settle. Inheritance is rarely tidy. Maduro's endurance means that inheritance begins before the era has clearly ended. People are already telling stories while events remain unresolved. This simultaneity complicates memory. It blurs past and present. And yet, even incomplete inheritance matters. It shapes expectations. It influences what people tolerate and what they resist. It informs how future leaders are judged. I think here of a young person hearing stories of scarcity and deciding that no leader should be trusted fully. Or hearing stories of endurance and deciding that people can survive anything. These conclusions are understandable. They are also partial. The challenge for the future will be to hold inheritance without letting it become destiny. As this part of the story draws toward its close, we recognize that what is carried forward is not only pain or resilience, but questions. Questions about responsibility. About choice under constraint. About how societies endure without losing themselves. In Part 20, we will bring this long journey to its final quiet rest. Not with a verdict, but with reflection. We will gather the threads of endurance, memory, rhythm, and inheritance, and set them down gently, acknowledging that history does not end cleanly, but it can be understood with care. For now, let the stories continue to be told softly. Let them travel between generations without demand for agreement. What is carried forward will shape what comes next, whether loudly or quietly, whether soon or slowly. Part 20, Setting the Story Down. As we come gently to the final part of this long journey, I slow my pace even further. Not because the story has resolved itself, but because it is time to set it down carefully, the way one sets down something heavy after carrying it for many miles. This is not an ending that closes doors. It is an ending that leaves them quietly ajar. Under Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela did not experience a single defining moment that explains everything. It experienced accumulation. Year led upon year. Decision led upon consequence. Adaptation led upon exhaustion. What remains at the end of this story is not a verdict, but a landscape shaped by endurance. I ask you to imagine standing at the edge of a long road just after dusk. The path behind you is visible only in fragments now. Certain moments stand out clearly. Others blur together. Ahead, the road continues, though its shape is harder to see. This is where Venezuela stands within its own recent history. The brutality of prolonged rule is not only measured in repression or deprivation. It is measured in duration. In how long people were required to live without resolution. In how often they were asked to adapt instead of participate. In how thoroughly uncertainty was normalized. And yet, what also remains is life. Throughout this story, we have returned again and again to ordinary moments. Kitchens. Streets. Classrooms. Bus rides. Conversations held softly. These are not footnotes to history. They are its substance. They reveal how power is experienced not as ideology, but as atmosphere. One of the most striking truths of this era is that Venezuela did not disappear into chaos, nor did it recover into justice. It existed in between. In that space, people learned how to live with contradiction. They learned how to endure without illusion, how to hope without expectation, how to imagine without certainty. This learning is neither victory nor defeat. It is inheritance. I pause here to reflect on what endurance means in historical terms. Endurance is often praised, but it is rarely chosen freely. It emerges when alternatives narrow, when departure is costly and confrontation dangerous. To endure is not to agree. It is to continue. Venezuela's people continued. They continued to care for one another, to share information, to build fragile routines, to create culture even when resources were thin, to teach children, to bury the dead, to celebrate what could still be celebrated. These acts did not overthrow systems, but they preserved humanity within them. At the same time, endurance carries cost. It trains caution deeply. It teaches restraint. It leaves behind habits of silence and self-limitation. These habits do not vanish when conditions improve. They require time and safety to loosen. This is the quiet challenge that remains. As this story comes to rest, there is a temptation to ask what it all means. To seek a moral or a lesson. History resists such neat conclusions. But certain understandings emerge if we listen carefully. One is that power sustained without consent does not require constant violence to be damaging. It requires time. Another is that societies can adapt to almost anything, but adaptation should never be mistaken for approval. And another still is that healing after prolonged strain is not dramatic. It is gradual, uneven, and deeply personal. Maduro's reign will be debated for decades. Documents will surface. Testimonies will accumulate. Interpretations will shift. Some will emphasize external pressures. Others internal decisions. Some will focus on endurance. Others on loss. All will carry fragments of truth. What should not be lost in those debates is the texture of lived experience. The feeling of standing in line without knowing if supplies would arrive. The instinct to lower one's voice. The habit of planning in contingencies. The quiet relief when a normal day passes without incident. These details matter. They are where history touches life. I imagine a future classroom where these years are taught. A teacher pauses, not over dates, but over stories. Over how people adapted. Over how systems endured without trust. Over how ordinary lives carried extraordinary weight. In that pause, understanding may begin. As background historian, I do not offer a final judgment tonight. History will do that in its own time, imperfectly. What I offer instead is recognition. Recognition that prolonged rule reshapes societies in ways that outlast leaders. Recognition that brutality can be quiet as well as loud. Recognition that endurance is complex, neither heroic nor passive, but deeply human. And now, as the night deepens, I gently set this story down. Venezuela's path continues beyond these words. Its people continue beyond this chapter. The questions raised here remain open, waiting for conditions that allow them to be answered more fully. For you, listening now, there is nothing required. No conclusion to reach. No position to take. Only the understanding that history is not something that happens only in moments of change. It happens in the long middle, in the waiting, in the adapting, in the carrying on. So let the story rest where it is. Not finished, but held. Let the road behind soften into memory. Let the road ahead remain undefined. And if you choose to drift into sleep now, know that this story, like so many others, continues quietly even when we are not watching. Thank you for walking this long path with me. And now, as the story gently loosens its hold, we arrive at a quiet place. We have walked a long road together tonight. Not a straight one, and not an easy one, but a road shaped by time, endurance, and the steady presence of ordinary lives moving forward under extraordinary weight. This was not a story of sudden endings or clear resolutions. It was a story of duration, of pressure stretched across years, and of people learning how to breathe within narrowing space. If there is anything to take with you into rest, let it be this understanding. History does not only unfold in moments of collapse or triumph. It lives in the long middle. In mornings that arrive despite uncertainty. In routines rebuilt after disruption. In quiet adjustments that allow life to continue even when clarity does not. You have listened to a story of power held tightly, and of a society reshaped not only by decisions made above, but by responses formed below. You have heard how endurance leaves marks, how memory travels across generations, how rhythm persists long after the loudest moments fade. None of this asks for judgment tonight. Only recognition. Recognition that people are more than the systems that constrain them. Recognition that survival is not consent. Recognition that healing, when it comes, rarely announces itself. It arrives softly, unevenly, asking for patience rather than certainty. As you rest now, you do not need to carry the weight of this story any further. You can set it down here, knowing that understanding does not require vigilance. The road continues without effort from you. The questions will wait. History always does. Let your breathing slow. Let the images drift away like evening light fading from a familiar street. The voices grow quieter now. The story has been told, carefully and completely, and it asks nothing more of you. If sleep comes, allow it. If wakefulness lingers, that is fine too. There is no urgency here. No demand to resolve what has been shared. Simply the permission to rest, knowing that even the heaviest chapters of history are held within a wider human continuity. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with the story until its final, gentle resting place. You may drift now, calmly, into the quiet that follows.